unless there's any objection to that, um, so that I can post it on our new website eventually, and give the floor to Aaron.
Thank you so much, Mike. It's an honor once again to be able to spend time with you all. I miss you terribly. I miss our suppers. I miss our conversation. This has been one of the tragedies, I think, of COVID is not being able to do what we normally do. But I'm so grateful for the opportunity to be able to see you and to spend a few moments sharing thoughts that I have been thinking about for the last year. When Mike asked me if I would speak, I quickly jotted off a title and a short description of my paper, and have subsequently, after writing the paper, changed the title a little bit. It was, as published, Epidemic, Obstructions, Dying, Death, and Grief in the Era of COVID-19. It is now Epidemic Epiphanies, Life, Death, and Meaning in the Era of COVID-19. So if that particular frame does not suit you and you did not come to hear that particular frame, I apologize ahead of time. I want to begin with a quote from one of my favorite modern theologians. If I can get my cursor to go, Cornel West, who is a theologian at Princeton University, who writes, to live is to wrestle with despair without allowing despair to have the last word. And I continue, I learned this, that we are all in plague, and I lost my peace. I'm looking for it today, trying to understand them all and not be anyone's deadly enemy. I only know that it is necessary to do what it takes to no longer be a plague victim, and that this is what can alone make us hope for peace or good death in its absence. This is what I can relieve men and, if not save them, at least do them the least harm possible, and even sometimes a little good. These are the words of Jean Tarou, the character in Albert Camus' 1947 novel La Peste, or The Plague in English. Tarou is vacationing in the Algerian city of Oran when the town is put into lockdown from an outbreak of plague, which is brought to light from increasing illness and death following a sudden epidemic which wipes out the town's rat population. Tarou's account of the town's ordeal is the basis for much of the chronicle of the town's, of the protagonist of the novel, Dr. Breau, and gives the account much of its literary texture. Unlike Dr. Breau, however, Tarou is considerably more philosophical in his rendering of Oran's deal than the good doctor. As one commentator puts it, as an atheist, Tarou does not believe in the illusion of an intrinsic rational or moral meaning in death, suffering, and human existence. For him, human existence gains meaning only when people choose freely to participate in the losing but noble struggle against death and suffering. This evening, it is this noble struggle which grounds my remarks. As we make our way into 2021, I would have us pause and consider a particular aspect of our communal experience of 2020, which is the experience we have witnessed in confronting the novel virus COVID-19 and the epidemic that has propelled itself across the globe. To begin, COVID-19, the name most commonly given to SARS-CoV-2, one of 7 types of coronavirus, including those that were the cause of the recent MERS or Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome and SARS, sudden acute respiratory syndrome, as well as viruses responding for illness such as the common cold. COVID-19 more often than not triggers an upper respiratory tract infection that can affect the sinuses, the nose, the throat, or the lower respiratory tract in the windpipe or the lungs, and can lead to pneumonia, respiratory failure, heart problems, liver problems, septic shock, and death. Complications from the virus are often caused by a condition known as cytokine release syndrome or cytokine storm, which is when the infection triggers an immune response that floods the bloodstream with inflammatory proteins called cytokines, which in turn kill tissue and damage organs. COVID-19 spreads like most coronaviruses through person-to-person contact, usually through contact with airborne saliva or mucus droplets containing the virus. Infections from COVID-19, as we know, range from mild to deadly. Unlike the SARS, aka SARS-1 virus, the airborne virus, which was first discovered in 2003, and the first readily transmissible new disease to emerge in the 21st century, SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19 is far more infectious. And because those infected with the virus are able to transmit it before the onset of symptoms, it is proven harder to control. Furthermore, COVID-19, for reasons yet fully understood, is as often carried and transmitted by those who remain asymptomatic. Those carrying SARS-1, on the other hand, most often became infectious, that is, able to transmit the infection at the onset of symptoms. And since the onset of symptoms more often is the rationale for seeking treatment, SARS-1 was and has been far easier to contain. The origin of the COVID-19 epidemic is thought by most scientists now to have been in December of 2019 at an outbreak in Wuhan, China, and thought to have been caused by the handling of bats in the Hunan seafood wholesale market in that province. 66% of the 41 initial cases in China are those who contracted the disease had a direct connection with the market. A month later, the market was shuttered as doctors and scientists were becoming more alarmed by the spread of illness, an illness with which the world is now all too familiar. And for a quick overview, good overview of the onset and trajectory, as well as the social implications of the disease, I commend to you a book, Apollo's Arrow, The Profound and Enduring Impact of Coronavirus on the Way We Live by Nicholas Christakis. Since the onset of the epidemic in December of 2019, worldwide there have been 92.3 million cases as reported today, with 1.98 million deaths and 51 million recovering from the disease, with a daily death rating from 6 on January 21, 2020 to a high of 15,454 on January 9th, 2021. And for reference, it might be noted that the United States tops the list, both in terms of cases and in terms of deaths. Since the onset of the disease, we have had 23.2 million cases of COVID-19 in the United States, and accompanying that, 386,000 deaths as of reported today. India, who ranks second to the United States, has had 10.5 million deaths, or 10.5 million cases of COVID, and 152,000 deaths. Brazil, 8.26 million cases and 206,000 deaths. Russia, 3.4 million cases with 62,000 deaths. And the United Kingdom, 3.21 million cases and 84,767 deaths for comparison. As we're well aware, the attempt to curb the spread of the disease has varied from requests to use personal protective equipment such as face masks, shields, gloves, and the use of hand sanitizer, to pleas to practice personal distancing, communal lockdown, travel bans, business closures, restrictions on the size of public gatherings, and visitation in nursing homes, care, and health centers. The impact of these measures on our individual and collective psyche has been both devastating and generative. To speak of devastation, epidemiologists have long understood the repetitive nature of the social drama associated with pandemic, coming often as it does in 4 phases. The first phase, denial and ignorance. The second phase, recognition and crisis. The third, attempts to blame and explain. And the fourth, finally, loss and resolution. The first three stages are clearly demonstrable with the current pandemic. One group of mental health clinicians remarked in a research article recently, in the pursuit of biological cures and vaccines against the virus, the socio-political infrastructure of the human ecosystem has been sadly neglected. Added to this, the plethora of misinformation that has led to stigma, xenophobia, and panic in interpersonal, social, and political domains, COVID-19 in that sense is a digital pandemic in which the tension and chaos spread faster than the virus itself. They continue, the novel coronavirus has ironically hijacked our everyday life and communication more than the respiratory system. It becomes difficult and confusing for the general public to be bombarded with plethora of data being updated every day. Similarly, discordant messages are prevalent about the lifespan of the virus, the presumed duration of the pandemic, routes of infection, safety precautions, dietary habits, and the necessary period of lockdown. No one day has passed in the last 2 months, or from my perspective, the last year, on which every source of media has not debated or argued about one or more of these aspects, ultimately with an ambiguous solution in the end. Learned helplessness to reflect to these effects of media have driven billions in their living rooms to consume the loads of data feeds about the virus and its fatalities throughout the day or months together. The penetration of this effect is now even more as social media is the primary consumption of people stranded at home. This confusion and the constant threat of mortality increases the absurdity during the pandemic and hence panic-stricken behavior. The mutual blame will eventually further divide us sociopolitically, only to be affected by another war of infection, wave of infection, or new pandemic some days later. Stigma and marginalization will increase the pre-existing ageism, social stratification, and hate that will proceed beyond this outbreak. Interestingly enough, on one level, the chaos demonstrates the exact reverse of the Darwinian notion of the survival of the fittest. As the same group of researchers notes, in disaster management literature, mortality salience is inversely proportional to social class structure. This survival of the fittest often leads to public chaos, violence, increase in poverty and unemployment, and eventually increase in criminality and aggression that can impact public health much more than the virus itself. To reiterate, in the words of another a researcher, the human species has not yet obtained a rational response to its impending mortality. Finally, going back to Camus, humans bury the social drama of the plague deep in their unconscious as a response to resolution of each pandemic. The social drama during pandemics or epidemics gives rise to panic-laden psychosocial reactions at large, referring to the absurdity of the plague. This absurdity has been reflected in the international blame game, interpersonal xenophobia, the chaotic spread of misinformation, and the rat race for statistical coverage of pandemic numbers. The long-lost virtues of solitude and emotional bonding through time spent with loved ones rather than virtual world has resurfaced into realization, converting loneliness into a significant offshoot of the pandemic. Likewise, note these same researchers, COVID-19 has given rise to conspiracy theories against certain countries related to the origins of the virus. With the debate ongoing, similarly, behaviors have been noticed in the past too. Anti-Jewish sentiments during the bubonic plague of the 14th century, the Spanish flu being a misnomer, even though the virus did not originate in Spain, anti-Asian remarks during the SARS pandemic, and racial discrimination during the Ebola outbreak in Africa, all are examples of disparate needs for scapegoating to explain uncertainty. As an aside, and to hazard outing my own political proclivities, I'd suggest that we have witnessed in the nation's capital last week also an example of the effect of the epidemic, and ponder if in the absence of the pandemic, we would have witnessed the same level of violent response to the election. Furthermore, and even more terrifying, at least to me, in the absence of the pandemic, I wonder if the election would have turned out differently. To say this is to ponder the role of death anxiety as central to understanding the interpersonal and social cost of the pandemic. Here again, the words of researchers already referenced. Death anxiety has been a topic of extensive research. It is defined as an innate driving force behind the human motives in life that influences various aspects of behavior and interaction. Based on terror management theory, or TMT, increased death terror during global threats shape society and acculturate the world. Examples of such death reminders are fundamentalist beliefs and terrorism, substance abuse, attachment security threats, economic competition, aggression for dominance, and war. With the prevalent instability during COVID-19, it might seem that the death threat is higher this time, hence contributing to increased chaos and adverse effects on social health. Accompanying the social implications of corporate death anxiety is the personal and corporate experience of death itself, the death of persons, the death of businesses, important life milestones and opportunities. As a minister, I've been privy to many of these deaths over the past year, burying those who have died, consoling the grief-stricken, assisting those who have lost their employment and business, feeding the hungry, bringing holiday gifts to those without any, listening to those whose graduations and dreams have been postponed or canceled, celebrating the lives of those who have died via video conference, talking by phone to many in forced isolation, teaching students over the internet, calming the anxiety of those serving on our community's front line who fear for their own lives and the lives of their families, listening to parents, teachers, and administrators who are overwhelmed, and sharing gratitude with those in the funeral industry whose work during the crisis has often gone unrecognized, just to name a few experiences. This spectrum of grief has also been an awakening to the inequitable effect of the disease that plagues us. The experience of pandemic has illumined long understood disparities, including access to technology, access to adequate healthcare resources, employment insecurity, retirement insecurity, homelessness, wage disparities, as well as the significant ongoing vulnerability of populations already on the margin, those who we more often rely on as our front line in the defense of the pandemic: home and assisted living and nursing home staff, grocery store clerks, wait staff, and social service personnel. And we understand now more than ever that because many of the frontline are also those made most vulnerable by systems that maintain economic, educational, and social inequalities, the massive racial disparity in health and economic outcomes exposed by this pandemic. Add to these our first responders, nurses and doctors, healthcare technicians, maintenance workers, housekeeping staff, administrators, teachers, classroom aides, and we include perhaps the majority of our workforce as more often exposed to the threat of this disease than not. Furthermore, those of you who remember the impact of war on the populations that fought them perhaps understand better than any the potential social cost we will bear for decades as we confront the protracted effects of this experience. My greatest fear is that our healthcare system will suffer the most from this disease. Like soldiers returning home from hard-fought and prolonged battle or deployments, we have allowed our healthcare workers to bear the brunt of the human cost of this pandemic. It would be wise, I suggest, that we as a community begin now to create means for long-term support and care of those who will likely carry the biggest scars from this prolonged experience. In the absence of this work, I fear that we will suffer far more the aftermath of the disease than the disease itself. Because of the response to the pandemic has necessarily limited the duration and type of contact we ought to have with each other in order to curb the spread of the disease, one of the most challenging and devastating experiences has been the inability to personally attend to those hospitalized or dying in clinical settings. The all too common report of dying alone or visiting via FaceTime or video conference has replaced the ability to stand vigil with those dying or to be personally present to care for the infirm. These restrictions have more than any other in my estimation, been the most challenging interpersonally. Quoting another recent research article, according to the British Geriatric Society, a good death comprises the following aspects: to know when death is coming, to be able to retain control, to be afforded dignity and privacy, to have control over pain relief and other symptoms, to have choice and control over where it occurs, to have access to spiritual and emotional support, to have access to hospice, not only hospital care, to have control over who is present and who shares the end, to be able to issue advance directives, to have time to say goodbye, and to be able to leave when it is time to go and not have life pointlessly prolonged. Because of the pandemic, these aspects of good death have all been challenged. In most cases, if available, our healthcare staff and chaplains have had to play the role of intermediary for those who are dying and their families. Such protracted experience of healthcare staff and patient intimacy adds to the emotional, psychological, physical, and spiritual burden of this disease on that population. And now to generativity. To speak of the generative potential of our corporate experience of pandemic is to begin to understand what power we have and don't have in the face of disease. As the researchers we've already heard from suggest, a conscious attempt to accept the stress, live through the uncertainty, refrain from indulgence in social media, and prevent unhealthy behaviors like hoarding, blaming, or stigmatizing can lead the way forward. There needs to be a fine but firm balance between unrealistic optimism and panic-stricken fear of extermination. That helps buffer the death anxiety from the inclusive social growth. In the words of other researchers, this anxiety can serve to modify the cognitions more towards self-sustenance and self-consciousness. The possible negative outcomes of this crisis can be used to find positive paths ahead. Ultimately, COVID-19 has stranded us all together with more time for our families and ourselves, time that was long overdue. People engage in lost hobbies, revisit forgotten skills, and nurture strained relationships. The social extravaganza of any celebration can be converted into true enjoyment and bonds that can be mended. Even nature has modified itself to be cleaner and purer in just a few months as unnecessary human movement has been restricted. All of this might have seemed idealistic last year, but a microscopic virus was all that was needed to turn these into reality. Or, as other researchers continue, in simpler terms, the obvious chaos attempts to stabilize the society, which has been alternately termed as creation's theory of conservation, according to some philosophers. While the human civilization is scattered and isolated due to the virus, many rare species of birds and animals are again seen to surface. Plants living longer and air becoming cleaner. This has been termed reverse chaos in one of the recent articles in The Guardian. In that way, the plague is not a tale of despair, but that of rejuvenation and lessons learned from redemption through the obvious sufferings. In the parlance of my own profession, the invocation to redemption in our current circumstance begins with creative human initiative. While we have been indeed plagued by many challenges this year, we have come up with as many and more creative responses to such challenges. Consider the following: mask making and homemade personal protective gear efforts and the cottage industries that have been developed from them. Networks of transportation assistance, video care circles and meeting spaces, massive fundraising efforts, hunger relief, testing sites, drive-by graduations and birthday parties, virtual weddings and funerals, FaceTime dinners, vaccine research and trials, takeout dinners, 24-hour homeless shelters, online mental health counseling, telemedicine, voting by mail, online political organizing, neighborhood phone trees, food cooperatives and food pantries, online worship services, online classes, remote work schedules, time with family, cleaner air, binge watching favorite movies and television series, reading books, and taking naps. And so much more has put on a different quality of life and meaning this year. So to close, I turn once again to the words of our researchers. The renowned sculptor Bernini once said, "Where there is death, there is new beginning." Many of his great arts depict fragility yet rejuvenation of life. This reminds us of yet another landmark existential work to understand and appreciate the sense and purpose of life through adversities. Sublimating our death fears through a new meaning has been the basis for logotherapy when Viktor Frankl details his ordeal and survival at Nazi concentration camps as a means to discover meaning in life. The solution to the absurdity at the face of COVID-19 is to achieve creativity and personal meaning, decrease the panic, and implement better coping and growth. This will help interpersonal as well as international connections. Hardships and struggle for survival have formed the face of human civilization for eons. Pandemic outbreaks are just reminders of the same. The philosophy of Camus can once again be revisited to develop a non-judgmental approach to counter the innate fear, anxiety, and despair for the eventual joy and gratitude that human resilience has always been capable of. The biopsychological damage done by COVID-19 cannot be undone. However, like the plague, let this also be a tale of redemption and survival, and not that of gloom and despair.
Fantastic.
Terrific.
Bravo. Very good.
Look like I'm not looking at you. I'm in a multi-screen array here, so I'm you all are on another screen. I'm going to move you down so it doesn't look so odd.
Okay. Aaron, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I I think that it's what's revolutionized too a lot is the way people interact with religion now, going to services in your bathrobe and doing it. And but really, it's been a very different way. We've connected with the Park Avenue Synagogue in New York, which is very active in the community socially and so on. And they have services of incredible music every weekend. And we reserve that time as sort of an oasis to have some spiritual sense and be away from all the news. And it's really, we organize our lives around doing that. And it's really meant the world to us. And I think your profession has a lot to give to people in that way. They have on average, when we look at the numbers, just live streaming, 1.5 thousand people listening from all over the world. And we've become another community together in their chat rooms responding to incredible services. Most of it is not as much written work, but beautiful music as well. That's all integrated. And it's sort of been a revitalization for us to connect.
it has, and Mark can speak to this as well. I will say to you, it's not just those who are attending services in their bathrobes, but I think Mark and I will be stunned that eventually we're going to have to be fully dressed in order to be able to worship. Because I have only been viewed from the chest up for over a year.
Hi, Mark.
I think in religious terms, for religious communities, this has been a developmental leap. I was saying this to my board this week. Had it not been for the pandemic and being forced to both access and purchase the necessary technology to do online services well, it would have probably been another 10 years before we would have evolved to doing this in a way. And I think the permanent effect of the pandemic is that very few of the communities that are now doing services online are going to go back to doing them solely in person.
Yeah.
Be a hybridized experience. That is both a blessing and a curse, because one can say the same thing for academic communities. And the horror of the pandemic ultimately is the loss of snow days. Think about administrations that are willing to say, well, if you can't be there in person, just go online, without the foggiest idea of the difference in preparation through platforms, right? And I also think that this technological imperative is going to transform the educational institutions as we know them, and it may likely provide a context for significant strife, especially within the university community. As it expands access, it also potentially makes professional education and professional educators during it. So it's a plus and minus that we're having to figure out in all of this.
Right. Our son and daughter-in-law are both in education, and the way they describe what's replicated all over the country is every day is a different day depending on the weather, in school, out of school, and the amount of preparation, you're right, to do the things by computers, infinitely more and challenging, and trying to preserve that kind of dialogue that's an essential part of the learning experience too. You know.
Absolutely.
Maybe I could add a word. I spoke to Torch about going to an English public school, which is a private school at the high school level. In my case, in England, and the British monarch does not make too many public addresses because they're not in day-to-day politics. But early on in this pandemic, the Queen made a speech which struck me as very appropriate. And what she said was, she knows this is going to be a very difficult time for most people. It will be a period of social isolation. But she said, just like you, Aaron, she said, at the same time, we should look at it as a blessing because it's a very rare opportunity given to us to slow down.
Mm-hmm.
You think of it, people needed to slow down. We were going at such a frenetic race without really knowing why we were racing or having to do so many things or go to so many places. And so it is a chance to rethink.
Thank you for that. Although I must admit, I do not feel like I have slowed down one iota.
Like that.
So, anyone else?
I think one of the things that's hard to evaluate is that idea of the effect of social determinants on public health. And that this things that this virus has imposed on society has made some of those social determinants even worse for the people who are lowest on the economic and well, is this to say the economic scale?
Economic, and I would say in relationship to that, also the racial disparities.
Right. Yeah.
No. And part of that is, I think, awakening to the fact that it has exposed vulnerabilities that we knew were there, but it has amplified them to a critical level. And we have begun to see how much we rely on often those in marginalized communities to perform the frontline tasks that are most vulnerable to disease when these outbreaks occur. So that it's kind of a double whammy in many ways.
And I think we all had the same reaction when they told the people in the gig economy to quarantine for 2 weeks, when you know damn well that they have rent to pay and they got to have income, you know.
And I think, the possibility moving forward of us understanding the need to strengthen our social safety net. The Massachusetts, Worcester was in receipt of a couple $1 million that was divided among 5 social service agencies locally to be able to assist people in who needed rent assistance and mortgage foreclosure assistance. And the RAFT program now has assistance up to $10,000 for those whose housing is in jeopardy. I hope that those programs don't simply drift into nothingness as we move forward, because the need is not going to diminish
Right.
necessarily.
Yeah, I haven't heard any real solid numbers, but I've read things that said that the number of homeless in Greater Worcester is going to double.
Well, if you think about the fact that over 60%, we talk in our community about affordable housing, and here's the challenge about that particular frame. Affordable housing suggests that you meet a benchmark that says that you have at least 10% of affordable housing in your stock of housing, and Worcester purports to have 13%. However, the number of what is affordable is determined not by looking at simply Worcester numbers, but by regional numbers. So that number includes Southbridge, Northborough, Westborough, places where where you simply cannot afford. So many of us are talking about the difference between affordable housing and sustainable housing. And sustainable housing looks at the percentage of the amount of income that households are using in order to apply to the cost of housing itself. And over 60%, I mean, over 7, I don't want to, there is a percentage, and I think it's somewhere between 60 and 70% that are using over 50% or more of their income, monthly income, to pay for housing. Which means that these are the folks that are food insecure, who are not able to pay for their medicines, who have scant technology because they're not able to sustain the effort to maintain that. Things that we have relied on in order to be able to thrive and survive during the pandemic are often aloof for these populations.
Right.
I guess I'll say one more thing. That part of the mental health trip of this whole event, it's more accentuated than it is from generation to generation, in that your life is sort of predicated on certain avenues that you have for support, certain plans you make that you can count on, certain basic realities. And when all of those things are changed, the emotional crisis of it can bring creativity, but also some despair. Where do you turn to now, particularly with all of the limitations that the pandemic itself brings to access that support?
So you look for the spiritual support.
But also you have to find other ways to deal with that. And I think one of them is also that a number of people may have medical conditions that don't reach the crisis proportion, but as the COVID crisis gets more deeply involved, the ability to access what would be routine care now becomes more exacerbated. Dentists are talking about, for example, they're doing many more root canals than before, and there's so many examples of all those things that
I had a
difficult decisions to be made.
root
Yeah.
canal at 8 o'clock this morning.
Yeah.
The fact that I'm able to speak at this moment is a miracle. But you know, take what you just said and think about the logic of healthcare systems and overwhelm. You know, the lens that we've been looking at is we're in overwhelm. We can't take any more COVID patients. You also can't take heart attack patients. You
Exactly.
can't take people of any serious illness into those ICUs. And so when we talk about rationing healthcare, ambulance sitting outside for 13 hours, people being turned away, ambulances being told in LA, if the likelihood of survival is less than a particular percentage, then they cannot come to the hospital. You know, the reality is it affects all of our healthcare, not just the care for those with COVID.
Exactly.
I was thinking this is a little bit of a tangent away from your talk, Aaron, but I was thinking as you spoke, life is filled with different ironies, and I always like the teabag saying that I read. Life is what happens while you're so busy planning. It all changes. And if you think of it, like in the case of Trump, our outgoing president, he felt the important thing was the economy, and he did not want to spend time on, the virus and coping with it very much, other than getting a vaccine started, which he called at warp speed, but the distribution doesn't seem to be going quite at warp speed. But I was
Pony Express.
Briarwood, yeah, at least if he got it at Briarwood, it's starting at least, which is good. But when you think of it, he was looking only at the economic side, not thinking of income inequality and of so many other important things. But ironically, if you think of it, his business is in the hospitality and recreation industries. Those are the industries that were hurt the most by the virus. And if he had spent a little time doing his job, working on the virus created issues, that would have helped him personally more than anything else. Perhaps get reelected like the Prime Minister in New Zealand because they felt she did a good job coping with the virus. And it would have helped him with his hotels and golf courses. So it's very ironic how things turn out.
I couldn't agree with you more, Bob. I think Trump totally blew it. I mean, look at what George Bush did with 9/11. He seized control of that. It ended up raising his popularity. He got reelected. It worked out very well. I think Trump could have done a similar thing with the virus. I think he had an opportunity there. He does not see those things because he sees life entirely in personal terms. It's all Donald Trump and Donald Trump and money. And he never could see through that he could take hold of that the virus and turn himself into another, in a sense, of George Bush and get reelected again. So I think you've got an excellent point. I'll shut up now. Thank goodness, by the way, you blew it. Thank goodness.
I think another topic that sort of fits in here is there really is a difference between virtual meetings and face-to-face meetings. And I wonder, one of my clients is Everyday Miracles, who have these peer groups of people who are recovering from substance use issues. And they've had to switch that all to Zoom like we're doing now. And I just don't know the empathy that exists in a face-to-face meeting of a bunch of people who are all in the same sort of terrible condition can be the same staring at a face on a Zoom screen.
Or to assume that all of them have access to technology.
Right.
which is probably a problem. Yeah.
And, we have, at the church, we have at any week when we're under normal operating procedures, 8 to 10 different 12-step groups that are meeting throughout the week in various ways. And all of them have gone online in order to maintain some semblance of contact, but it is no substitute for being present with someone.
No, I was talking to a woman named Laura Farnsworth, who runs the LGBT program for Open Sky, which used to be called The Bridge.
Yeah.
And they had meetings of teenagers every Thursday. And back before the pandemic, they would get 50 to 100 teenagers. Now they're having a real problem trying to make that happen virtually. And the teenagers have had it with screens and things. And they don't get the kind of peer support that they used to have.
They don't, but the other side of it is, as Gail was talking about, one of the interesting boons of doing these things online is, in churches in particular, is that people who would not normally be able to travel to go to an in-person meeting now had access. So, we have people all over the country that are now coming on to a Zoom service as an example, and people who were former members of the congregation who want to check in. So, on some level, there is this back and forth between, there is no substitute for in-person meetings. And, when we add technology to the possibility of in-person meetings, we expand our ability to serve people exponentially.
Yeah, very good point.
Mark, you were shaking your head yes there. What has been your experience?
Well, it's been very similar to what Aaron's been expressing. When I use, I record our services and then put it on, upload it to YouTube. And so you have some analytics there where you can see how many, are kind of tuning in. And wow, I don't have this many people in the congregation. Where are they all coming from?
Exactly.
So yeah, it's all around the country. It is people who have moved away. We have a single woman who moved out to Arizona 3 years ago. I was heartbroken when she needed to go out there. Well, she's been tuning in every single week now for the past year. Colleagues and friends from school who have, have tuned in and found some community in doing it. So it is a both and kind of situation. You grieve the loss of intimacy, of the touch and the hug and the, eyeball to eyeball kind of thing. But there is an outreach that you've never imagined before. So, and this pandemic has given us permission, I think, to make changes that we maybe would not have made because we were holding back for one reason or another. But hey, the pandemic's here, why not? And there is a kind of a go for it kind of thing. And as I've gone into this new year with a new leaders and things like that, that's part of what I'm trying to encourage, is let us use this time to do further exploration and to really let go of things. Church will be forever changed.
Certainly will.
Briarwood has its own internal TV station here.
Right.
Sunday mornings, they have 3 services. One, I believe, is Mark.
Is ours. Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know I think one is First Baptist.
And there's a Lutheran. I don't know if it's Trinity Lutheran or who it is, but yeah.
Unitarians over there at some point.
For a good number of residents here, it's not easy going to church. I mean,
Absolutely.
Look at churches, they're not designed for elderly people. Let's be honest. Chairs and benches are miserable.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, as some of you may attest, when you are coupled and you have one that is more capable of attending these kinds of things and one who may not be able to do so, to be able to access this from the comfort of your living room allows you to have the kind of shared experience that you might not otherwise be able to have in person. You know, that
Amen, amen.
But you don't have the coffee hour afterwards, you know what I mean? Really miss.
what you don't have is the coffee made for you. We have coffee hour after our service. We go into breakout rooms on Zoom, and people spend up to an hour in discussion with each other after the service.
Great.
You know, that's been quite remarkable.
Now, can they talk about any subjects, you know, or
Far
does
be
it
it
have to
from
be
me
religious related?
Far be it from me to constrain people to talk about anything. They can talk whatever they want.
They're coffee hour conversations, Bob. So it could be about the service, or it could be about the current events, or it could be about families.
About the Red Sox or the Patriots or anything like that?
Well, yeah, if you're with Peg Gifford, you'll talk about the Red Sox. Yeah, I was kind of affected by the coronavirus in that I lost my caregiver for Rita in March because she had a child at home with special physical issues, and she didn't want to bring home COVID. So for a long time, I didn't have a professional respite. In July, she went up to memory care, and then didn't fit in. Let's put it that way. But then she went to the hospital again. I couldn't visit her in the hospital except like once a week. And then when she moved out of the hospital after 5 weeks, she went to the Oasis. And despite being tested for COVID, she was still quarantined for 2 weeks. And I couldn't see her then, and she died during the quarantine. So I have a lot of regrets in that when I found out she died, I had no clue that was even a risk. So COVID affected my ability to be a caregiver myself, in that I gave that up for the professionals, but it also affected my ability to communicate comfortably. I guess I could have called them 3 times a day, but that's not my style. So I think that personal issues are trumped by community protection, and I don't know whether that's completely necessary or not. In other words, Rita moved to the Oasis having a clean COVID test, and yet she was quarantined for 2 weeks. That's the part I really was frustrated about.
And I think that's been the catch in all of this is how do the rules apply and take priority in various situations? You know, I think it speaks to some of the, you know, well-intentioned but absurd application of public health measures that have taken place during this time. In absurd not in the literal sense, in the sense that you know, when we look at circumstance, you know, that has taken a second kind of hit to regulation, if you will, in many cases.
Okay, well, I want to thank you, Aaron, for a wonderful talk, and Mark for joining us.
Thank you.
Um, I do not have a speaker identified for next month yet, but I will reach out and figure out who that's going to be. It's great to see you all again. We can remain. I'm going to stop the recording now, but we can remain and continue to chat. Um, but yeah, if you want to go, you can. You're free to go.